Hi, my name is Allan from Rational Realm. Welcome to this first part of a two-part series on is morality subjective or objective? This is a recording of my address to Philosophy Matters on 24th February 2020 in Melbourne, Australia. To find out more, visit the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com. Welcome everyone to this session of Philosophy Matters, where we'll be talking about is morality subjective or objective. It's a two-part series, so today's the first part and then the second part will be in a month's time. So the format is I plan on speaking for about half an hour, and you can ask questions of clarification while I'm doing that, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity for discussion questions afterwards. So this talk tonight is based on an essay I wrote back in 2015. It's called Is Morality Subjective? And I also wrote a sequel to that, a reply to critics, and they're both in the references section of the handout. Now, in the handout also is a couple of transcripts of talks on this subject. I've got other variations of this talk, which I just want to briefly explain. This talk is an amalgamation of two previous talks. One talk, which is called Is Morality a Matter of Taste? And that one's directed to naturalist friends of mine who call themselves subjectivists. And that talk was specifically about why it's a bad idea to call yourself a subjectivist. The other variation of this talk, which is called Can Morality Be Objective Without God?, is aimed at those people who want to call themselves objectivists from a theological perspective, with a theological grounding. And in that talk, I argue, yes, ethics has an objective dimension, but it's not based on God's existence. So I've kind of amalgamated those two talks to have this broader view, answering the subjectivists and answering the theological objectivists, which actually we don't really talk much about the theological objectivists much in this talk. But I do bring together those two streams about should we be objectivists or should we be subjectivists into this two-part talk. And maybe that's why it's panned out to two parts and not one part. So you can grab these on my Rational Realm website, and you can go on the homepage, go straight to the ethics section, and there'll be a list of essays there, or on any page, just go to the top menu bar, philosophy drop down, select ethics there, and you'll see all the papers listed, and you can download, I think all of them you can download as PDFs as well. So for those who don't know me, let me say a little bit about my background. I got interested in science and then religion from quite an early age. I was initially very interested in astronomy when I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Then I got really interested in chemistry, and then I got really interested in electronics, and then electronics became my first career for some 20 or 30 years. And then while I was studying electronics at RMIT, one of my good friend classmates, Gary, he was quite an ardent Christian, and we used to have lots of friendly arguments. And that really piqued my interest in the history and philosophy of religion. So then I enrolled at RMIT. Then I enrolled at La Trobe Uni, and I studied at La Trobe Uni for some 9 years throughout the 79 to 89. And my two main interests were in philosophy. I was majoring in philosophy. My two main interests were ethics. The other area is what's called epistemology, which is the philosophy of knowledge, and I was particularly interested in the philosophy of science. I did that part-time while I was still having a career and changing careers. So career-wise, my first 20 or 30 years was in electronics. Then I got into the training and development area. I was training vestibule radio technical officers, and then I got my first redundancy, and then over a number of other years, and I had 3 more redundancies after that. So there was quite a few changes in my career. I did some work in managing projects. I did a fair amount of work with organisations in training and development, skill development. Did a bit of work in quality management, and did a fair amount of work in improving processes. I semi-retired, almost retired some 4 years ago, and that allowed me to get back to my key interest, which is science and philosophy. And I started to develop the Rational Realm website, and I've been putting up my papers and then writing new stuff, and this stuff on ethics is new. It's based on stuff that I did back at uni, but I've developed some themes there as well. I've also been quite active in the secular and skeptical movement. I was on the early committee of Skeptics Australia when they formed in, I think, 1979, 78. And also I've been on the committee and served as Vice President and Secretary for Humanist Victoria, which was called Humanist Society Victoria. I'm still currently on the committee. Okay, so that's me. Now, before I introduce the subject of tonight's talk, I'd like to get a feel of where you guys are all at with this question of objectivity and subjectivity in ethics. So I want to ask you first, who among you thinks that morality is objective, and take the term objective to mean what you mean by objective? So how many of you think that morality, ethics is objective? And how many of you think that, I'm not going to write down your name, just numbers. How many of you think that ethics is subjective? And there again, take the term subjective to what you mean by subjective. How many of you think that ethics is subjective? And how many of you are undecided or think that it can't be decided?
I like to class myself as either.
Neither? Right. Yep. And you haven't changed your mind, Vince?
No,
Right.
I don't like those terms.
Right.
So
Yep. Good. And you've got good reason not to like those terms either.
I've read your paper.
Sorry?
Read your paper.
You read my paper. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but I don't like those terms myself. I think they're very confusing, especially people starting out in philosophy, but even for people who are well versed in philosophy as well. All right, so over these two sessions, I want to talk about these three key ideas. The first is that morality has both an important objective and a subjective dimension, and to say that it's one or the other, either or, I think is a big mistake. The second key idea is that there's a long and distinguished tradition in moral philosophy and religious ethics that sees objectivity in ethics as the requirement for impartiality. The third key idea is that what we learn from linguistic and philosophical analysis is that moral language also has a subjective dimension, which is the expressive function of moral language, which I'm going to cover a little bit today, but I'm going to cover the expressive function of moral language more in the second part of the talk. So they're the three key ideas I want to get over. So in part one, today's session, I'll introduce thinking about the nature of morality with a typical everyday moral argument. I'll then show how four dominant views in moral philosophy seriously misconstrue how ethics can be objective. By properly contrasting different senses of objective and subjective, I'll go on to articulate how being objective in moral reasoning does not preclude a necessary subjective element as well. And then in part two, next month, I'll say more on the expressive function of moral language that gives it its subjective character. I'll then return to filling out the case that ethics is also importantly objective by looking at how objective is formally defined and how it is used in legal reasoning. I'll also review how the requirement for impartiality appears centrally in the five most prominent theories of ethics and in the long history of religious thinking on the subject. So, starting off with part one, today's session, I want to start by examining the moral subjectivist notion that when we make a moral judgment, we are doing nothing more than expressing or describing our personal preference. So, on this account, saying charity is good is the same kind of judgment as saying that dress looks good. On this view, ultimately, moral judgments just come down to personal taste. Now, picture this scene. 3 friends are sitting around the coffee table arguing over a moral question that is still very much in the news, voluntary euthanasia. They're discussing whether people enduring unbearable pain, much of the time while suffering a terminal illness, ought to be able to end their lives as they choose. Now, Fred says the terminally ill ought to have that right, as people have a right to act autonomously, unless the act harms someone else. And then Mary says the terminally ill ought not, as instituting such a right will lead to abuse, with some elderly coerced into ending their lives. And John, he says quite boldly, the terminally ill should be prevented from choosing the manner of their own death. Now, Fred and Mary ask John why he thinks so. Then after a brief pause, John replies, I just like it that way. And then Fred and Mary press John further. Why do you want to prevent people from choosing how they die? And John just pushes back, just simply insisting, that is just what I want. Now, I want to pause for a moment and ask you to reflect on what you think of John's contribution to the moral discussion. Now, note here, I'm not asking whether you think John's conclusion is right or wrong, but about his style of reasoning for his conclusion, about the nature of his contribution.
It's just an opinion. He's not putting a position forward on morality.
But as a moral reason, as a moral argument, how do you think it goes?
It's pretty weak.
Pretty weak.
It's non-existent.
Non-existent? Non-existent. Anyone think the same or differently, Vince?
The same. It's
Same?
weak in the sense it's not even legitimately able to be put forward in this kind of debate.
And why do you think it's not legit? Why do you think it's not legitimate?
Well,
Matt?
I think moral reason must rise above a threshold that's higher than just your own personal preference.
Right. Yep.
I'd go with it. I reckon John's got it. He's got the best one.
And why?
Oh, because I think morality starts with a gut instinct, starts with a feeling.
All right, so we've got a little bit of a spread. So what I want to propose is that Fred and Mary are offering a moral reason for their judgment, so going along with Matt and Vince. Their reasons are based on considerations broader than their own personal wants and preferences. Of course, we may disagree with one or both of their justifications, but I think it natural to say that they are advancing a moral argument. Regarding John, however, I propose that he's not offering a moral reason for his judgment at all. Recall what he said, I just like it that way, that is just what I want. By exclusively appealing to his own personal preferences, he seems not to have engaged in the moral debate at all. He may be advancing a prudential reason for his view. However, I think it's natural to insist that he's not putting forward a moral justification for his position. His stated reason is outside the bounds of moral discourse. So I think this scenario shows that for a reason to be a moral reason for action, we expect it to be impartial, without appeal to the speaker's peculiar interests or the interests of their favoured group. We think people who give a partial or selfish reason for a moral judgment as being conceptually confused about what constitutes a moral reason for action. This requirement for impartiality, I want to say, is built into the very concept of morality. Most moral philosophers down the ages have felt that morality is objective in some sense, and here they are in agreement with the person on the street. However, in their attempt to explain this sense of objectivity, some philosophers and most theologians have been looking for this objectivity in the wrong place. They've been looking for it in some mind-independent or human-independent metaphysical realm. And I think this project has failed. So I want to point here to 4 prominent examples. This is in the history of moral philosophy. The intuitionist, and this is a classic modern day intuitionist, George Moore. Intuitionists mistakenly conflate moral attributes with some mysterious realm of non-natural properties and transcendent rules. On this view, the goodness of giving to the poor, for example, is as much a part of the objective properties of the act as how much money was given and who it was given to. Immanuel Kant, very well known and famous Enlightenment philosopher, Kantian rationalists, the people who followed Kant, try to derive moral rules from the demands of pure reason. According to Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, we should act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. Thirdly, natural law theorists and virtue ethicists rely on a dubious teleology of life's evolution on earth. For them, we act morally when we act according to our innate natures that allow us to fulfill our purpose. And lastly, the divine command theorists, and these are pretty thin on the ground these days. Divine command theorists try to identify the good and the right with God's preferences and commands. On this view, to say that something is good is just to say that God approves it. Now, I've devoted an entire talk to the religious notion of objective morality that I referred to before, and once again see that paper, that's actually the transcript of a talk, Can Morality Be Objective Without God, for more of an in-depth look at that way of looking at objectivity in ethics. Now, the mistake for these four kinds of thinkers is in thinking that objectivity in ethics must be contrasted with subjectivity, where subjectivity is meant in the sense of being grounded in people's attitudes and preferences. Their mistake is in thinking that ethics is objective only in the epistemic sense, that ethics is about human independent facts that are there to be discovered and known. So let me illustrate this way of thinking by these four key thinkers. I've called it approach one. So this is how these four kinds of thinkers identify the objective nature of morality and contrast this with subjective preferences. So on this view, being objective in ethics is recognising some human independent facts, whether it be God commands, non-natural properties according to the intuitionists. And for them, to say that John is bad, to make a moral evaluation, is cognitively the same kind of thing as saying John is mad, where bad and mad are both objective properties of John. And they contrast that with the way we shouldn't be doing ethics, and that is being subjective. And they say we've got to make sure that we don't bring our own human attitudes and preferences into making moral judgments. That's how they say ethics is not subjective and ought not to be subjective. And the kind of view they're attacking is like when we say, yay, Collingwood. We're not saying anything descriptive about Collingwood, the football team. We're not describing the team in any way. We are just, quite a raw way expressing our approval for Collingwood. And if that's the case, then these objectivists are saying that's not what ethics is about. However, from the work done by moral philosophers, especially since the Enlightenment, we know that morality is somehow intimately grounded in people's attitudes and preferences. And I've put a green tick next to this way that moral judgments are subjective. So I'm saying that moral judgments do express human attitudes and preferences, and we'll explore that later as we go along. So that's an unavoidable characteristic of making moral judgments. So saying charity is good, for example, expresses a preference for a particular kind of action in the same way that, yay, Collingwood expresses a preference for a particular football team. Now, it's much more complex than that, and we'll go into how it's different from that, but that is a core element of the way ethics is subjective. We're expressing a pro-attitude or a con-attitude to what we're talking about. So I'm going to be talking more about this expressive function of moral language at our get-together next month. So the upshot here is that contrasting objectivity in ethics with this kind of subjectivity can't be right. On the other hand, we also know that morality is not just about what we like or personally prefer. There is more to saying torturing children is morally abominable than just expressing our dislike or disapproval of such torture. Our scenario with Fred, Mary and John concretely brings this home. The puzzle is solved, I suggest, by thinking of objectivity in ethics as more correctly contrasted with subjectivity, where subjectivity is meant in the sense of being partisan, selfish and parochial. Think of the inappropriateness of John's response in our scenario. There, John gave an answer wholly based on his personal preference and on nothing else outside of him. Being objective in ethics then should be seen as being more like this, and this is what I call approach 2. So in this approach, being objective in ethics is making a judgment that's impartial and considers the interests of others impartially. And a good example of that is making the moral evaluation like, that tax policy is fair. That's a really concrete way of making a moral judgment that is really giving expression to this notion of fairness, impartiality. This is the proper way to make a moral judgment, and contrasting that with the improper way of making a moral judgment, like John did, and that's being subjective in the sense of having a parochial view that serves your own interests or the interests of your own favoured group. And a good example of that is like when you say, that tax policy benefits me. Once again, that's not a moral judgment, doesn't pretend to be a moral judgment, because it's all about the speaker. So in this view of the distinction between being objective and being subjective in our moral judgments, being objective is not about tapping into some transcendental realm of moral facts or divine commands. It's about being impartial, non-partisan in our moral judgments. So I put a green tick next to this way, that our moral judgments are striving to be objective. Conversely, when we accuse someone of being subjective in their moral reasoning, we're not calling them out for expressing their preferences and attitudes. We're accusing them of basing their moral judgments on their own selfish interests or on those of their favoured group. This then is how I think we properly contrast objectivity in ethics with subjective preferences. All right, so I want to put all of this together now and contrast these two ways of viewing ethical discourse. So we can say that the initial view we considered in the top row, approach 1, and that is the view that's given by the divine command theorists, the intuitionists, the natural law theorists and so on, that I quickly touched on, that this view is mistaken. So I put a big red cross next to this approach, approach 1. On that view, an objective moral judgment is one that taps into a human independent realm of moral facts untainted by personal preferences. Now I've also put a big green tick next to approach 2, the second approach. On that approach, an objective moral judgment is a judgment that aims for impartiality and strives to avoid partisanship and self-serving bias. So I want to conclude my talk tonight by emphasising that ethics is not either objective or subjective. I think we can say that ethics has both an objective dimension and also it's got this subjective dimension. To say that it is either one or the other is to cast a false dichotomy. So let's look briefly at each of these in turn to wrap up. The subjective dimension encapsulates the human-centeredness of morality. So I think it captures these two aspects. Firstly, it captures the evolutionary underpinning of our altruistic behaviours. And here I include the writing of kin altruism in our genes and the social learning aspect of reciprocal altruism. Now, the seminal work on this was Richard Dawkins with his really seminal work, The Selfish Gene. And Peter Singer also does a good treatment of this in his The Expanding Circle. If you get this, get the second edition, which has been updated by Peter some time ago. Now, this is still a rich field of research for evolutionary biologists and evolutionary psychologists. Secondly, this subjective dimension captures how our moral norms are historically grounded in social customs and contracts. Our complex legal systems are underpinned by moral considerations, and these have evolved historically from earlier social mores, the agreed social customs that lubricate social interaction for mutual cooperation and benefit. Now, the objective dimension, on the other hand, encapsulates the impartial nature of morality. I think this dimension explains these two key aspects of morality. Firstly, it accounts for our appeal to reason and argument based on general principles. Secondly, it accounts for our barring of appeals to parochial interests. And again, take you back to John in our scenario where he just says, I just like it that way. So to wrap up this talk, let me summarise what I've tried to show tonight. I introduced a scenario of three friends discussing the ethics of voluntary euthanasia to illustrate how the notion of impartiality fits in our everyday moral reasoning. Next, I suggested that it is this requirement for impartiality that constitutes the objective dimension of morality and not some discernment of human independent facts. I then properly contrasted this important sense of objectivity in moral reasoning with its subjective antithesis, that of offering self-serving, parochial or biased reasons. At the same time, I suggested that moral judgments are necessarily subjective in some sense, the sense in which moral judgments express our preferences. And then I concluded with my key contention that ethics has both a central objective and a subjective dimension, and that it is a mistake to think it only one or the other. Now, next month, in the second part of this two-part session, I'll be looking more deeply at the subjective expressive function of moral language and consider a serious objection to the view that ethics can be objective at all given this subjective dimension. And I'll wrap up with some examples showing how the concept of impartiality in ethics has a long and distinguished tradition in both moral philosophy and the history of religions. To find out more, I encourage you to check out my original short essay, my reply to critics, and the transcripts of those two earlier talks in the handout, in the references section, and the first two chapters of Peter Singer's book, Practical Ethics, also explain in plain language this view of objectivity in ethics as impartiality of judgment. Now, I can't speak too highly of Peter Singer's book. The reason why Peter Singer was voted as the most influential living philosopher, I think it was by Time magazine, is because he can write about highly dense philosophical issues in really down-to-earth plain language, and Practical Ethics is probably the best example I've seen of a philosopher doing that. It's really down to earth, it's really graspable. And in the first, 2 or 3 chapters where he talks about the notion of impartiality is really good. So I highly recommend that. So thanks again for listening to me talking, and now I'm looking forward to having questions and getting into some meaty discussion. So thanks. This recording was produced by Allan on the 3rd of March 2020. To access other talks and essays, visit the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com. For the latest news, visit the Rational Realm Facebook page. Our Twitter handle is @RationalRealm.